So I recently discovered the Poppy Playtime series because of all the meme songs and lore videos that my kids are into. If you're not familiar with the games, think of them as a mashup between Portal and Five Nights at Freddy's, with about 75% platforming and puzzles and 25% pants-soiling terror. The jump scare encounters are easily the most memorable parts of each game, and now that I'm finished with Chapter 4, I wanted to do an analysis of each one, ranking them from worst to best based on how well they execute on their horror elements. The only rule I have is that the encounter must have at least one possible jump scare and it must end your game. Sorry Nightmare Huggy, this is not the video for you. So let's kick things off with number 13, the Nightmare Critters. These guys are basically the smiling critters from Chapter 3, except with a layer of black eyeliner and My Chemical Romance in their Spotify rap. They're so lame that I honestly debated including them on the list at all, since even though they can technically jump scare you, it's only after hitting you multiple times, and even then it's not guaranteed. Your first encounter with the Hot Topic enthusiast is actually the first proper encounter in Chapter 4. After grabbing your red hand upgrade, you go back out into the prison and the doctor shuts off the lights. Your heart immediately starts racing in preparation for an epic showdown, but what you get instead is this really weird action-based encounter where the critters come out and annoy you for a little bit while you launch flares in their faces to scare them away. At no point during this encounter are they even remotely threatening, and this is also true when you run into their leader, Baba Chops, a literal black sheep of the family if the edginess wasn't hitting hard enough already. So yeah, they may be fast and furious, but the only thing they're ever gonna hurt is the pace of the game, and of this video if I talk about them anymore, so let's move on to number 12, Wuggy. This is the second minigame from Chapter 2, where the object of the game is to prevent these little Huggy Wuggies from getting too up close and personal by punching them in the face with your grab pack. You've got ample warning to deal with them since you can hear them crawling through the pipes long before you can actually see them, and when you're a few seconds away from getting jump scared, they'll helpfully growl at you to let you know they mean business. Now, it can honestly feel pretty hectic when you're deep into the game with multiple Huggy Wuggies coming out at the same time, especially when you're in the middle of trying to smack one of the little bastards into next Wednesday only to hear the sweet dulcet tones of another one getting ready to pounce. But frankly, I don't even think I've ever really been close to losing this game. And look, I know that Huggy Wuggy is one of the most iconic horror characters in gaming, but it just felt kind of lame to be facing off against less threatening versions of him here. Moving on to our first proper encounter of the list, I'd like to preemptively apologize for this one because at number 11 we have Doey the Doughman. This is the final boss fight in Chapter 4, and I feel kinda bad ranking it so low because it is a final boss fight, but I just don't think it's very well designed, both in terms of the encounter itself and the tone that it tries to strike. For some context, Chapter 4 is named Safe Haven after the underground sanctuary where Doey watches over the experiments who haven't been corrupted by the prototype. After it's destroyed at the end of the game, Doey has a complete mental breakdown and transforms into this gigantic monster, leading to a short chase sequence followed by a boss battle. And while there's a lot of spectacle here, it completely misses the mark when it comes to actual horror. Horror tends to be most effective when it creates a sense of helplessness and isolation, but with the Doey encounter, there's really no point at which you're made to feel like you're in any actual danger, since not only are all of his attacks easily avoidable, but even if he does manage to grab you, all you have to do is shoot him in the face with your flares to make him go away. And the other thing is that if you're not already intimately familiar with the arena itself, the encounter goes on for so long that it just feels more tedious than anything else. All I'm saying is that when the most tense part of your boss fight is wondering whether you're going to be forced to do the whole thing over again because he got bugged out and stuck in a wall, that's not a good sign. At number 10 we have Harley Sawyer, aka the Doctor. The penultimate encounter of Chapter 4 sees you confront perhaps the most overtly evil entity in the entire Poppy Playtime universe. After dealing with Fallout Boy's biggest fan, and if you're anything like me, murdering the crap out of a helpless nightmare critter, you make your way up to the Doctor's lair only to be unceremoniously dumped into a server room by one of his mechanical bodies. In order to get back to him, you'll need to search for 4 batteries scattered throughout the lab that are being guarded by even more of his bodies. On paper, this sounds awesome, roaming through dimly lit corridors while lifeless mechanical bodies lurk in the background, never knowing if or when they're going to wake up and grab you. But like so many of the encounters in Chapter 4, it has a great setup, but completely falls flat when it comes to delivering on the horror. The robots are easily avoidable and basically can't kill you as long as you're sprinting away from them. So once again, it becomes clear really early on that you're never in any actual danger here. And it's unfortunate because had this been a proper stealth sequence, it probably could have been one of the standout encounters in the series, especially if you're deep into the lore. But instead what we got felt like much more of a minor inconvenience than an actual threat. Coming in at number 9, we've got the Ruin Critters. These guys are the preppy, well-adjusted cousins of the Nightmare Critters who went to private school and drink matcha latte frappuccinos or whatever the hell it is rich people do all day. I used to be pretty down on this encounter when I first went through it, but honestly the more that I've played through Chapter 3, the more I've come to appreciate the subtle horror that these little guys bring to the table. The first one you see comes out of a wall all by itself. It kind of saunters along after you, and like the Nightmare Critters, it's deathly afraid of flares, so it really doesn't seem all that threatening at first. But as you make your way deeper into the playhouse, they start to come out of the walls and the vents in droves, following you menacingly with their distorted, childish giggles. And it gives you this eerie sense that they're not really concerned if you decide to run away because they'll get you eventually. And what makes this even creepier is that while you're solving the final block puzzle, they could literally be anywhere. And it's like every time you turn a corner, there they are with their unearthly white eyes locked onto you. And it just does a really good job at making you feel like you're never safe. Now, don't get me wrong, they're still at number 9 on the list because as long as you know how to manage your flare charges, you're going to be just fine on repeat playthroughs. I'm just saying that it's obvious that a lot of thought went into making the design and placement of the Ruin Critters feel genuinely threatening, which at the very least is more than I can say for their edgy edgelord cousins. Moving on to number 8, we have Yarnaby. You actually run into this guy twice, but we're mostly going to skip over the first encounter since it consists of a single hallway and a chase sequence that's so mind-numbingly easy that if you fail it, I genuinely feel bad for you and would suggest that you probably delete your game. The second encounter is a colossal pain in the ass and by far the most tedious thing I had to deal with in my first playthrough. You basically need to do a series of puzzles where you have to use your grab pack to send electricity to different switches and then redirect the current to open doors. But there's a catch. When you use your grab pack, Yarnaby will immediately home in on your location, and you'll have to find a place to hide and pray that the game doesn't bug out and have him kill you anyway. This becomes really obnoxious during one part of the puzzle where, in order to turn on the switch, you need to hold your hand on 3 different scanners for 15 seconds each, all while dealing with constant interruptions from our fine fuzzy friend here. This is followed by a chase sequence that's not much more interesting than the first, though I guess if you're a glue eater like me and somehow fail to notice the gigantic glowing chain you're supposed to swing off of, it can spice things up a bit. Now, I know that I'm being kind of a jerk about this encounter, but in reality I do think it's actually really intricately designed, and I love the idea of having a puzzle that makes you scared to solve it because doing so will draw the monster closer to you. The problem is that like literally every other encounter in Chapter 4, the execution leaves a lot to be desired here. Yarnaby is constantly in your face throughout the entire thing, and if you get caught, he has this really annoying tendency to turn into the world's most obnoxious Call of Duty player and spawn camps you every time you reload your game, which pretty much kills all the tension and instead just makes you feel frustrated more than anything else. All of this in combination with a relatively uneventful chase sequence takes what could have been a really amazing encounter and instead make it feel like it really should have spent some more time in playtesting. But oftentimes you don't need to make something overly complicated for it to be effective, and one of the best examples of that design philosophy is our number 7 pick, Musical Memory. This is the first of Mommy Longlegs minigames in Chapter 2. The way it works is that a sequence of colors will pop up on the screen, and you need to replicate that sequence by hitting the buttons in front of you while Bunzo slowly descends from the ceiling. Get the sequence right and he rises back up, but get it wrong and he drops down even faster. It might seem weird putting this so high on the list, especially in comparison to encounters like Yarnaby or the Doctor, but honestly, this is the first entry on the list where I actually felt scared during my first playthrough. I think a big part of that fear comes from how Bunzo is introduced. When you first hear the rules of the game, he's not really doing anything other than swaying back and forth above you, so you kinda just forget that he's even there. But then when Mommy's taunting you before the game starts, she casually drops a line talking about how he hasn't eaten in so long, and his shadow unexpectedly appears in the ceiling above you, causing you to look up in surprise and find that Bunzo is just inches from your face. The developers of Poppy Playtime are generally very creative in their subtle use of environmental or lighting cues to guide your eyes, and I absolutely love Musical Memory's clever use of shadows to create a moment that was genuinely startling without actually having to resort to being a full-on jump scare. It just goes to show that when it comes to horror, sometimes less really is more. Now, oh man, do I have my work cut out for me in justifying this next pick. At number 6, we have CatNap. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room right away. From a pure gameplay perspective, I absolutely love this encounter, and it's honestly one of my favorites in the entire series. The way it works is that there are 5 batteries scattered throughout the room. You need to use 4 of them to charge up this electricity node to blast CatNap with
21 gigawatts!
and send his ass back to the future. But there's a catch. Batteries can only be loaded into the terminal once every 45 seconds, and in between rounds, CatNap will be prowling the halls attempting to get to you. He can come from one of 4 directions, and you can get rid of him by strategically using the leftover batteries to spring traps. It sounds simple, but by the end you'll only have 1 battery to use that you need to bounce between 3 different sockets depending on where he's coming from. It can honestly get pretty stressful trying to manage all this information on your first couple times through the game, but as you get better and better at the encounter, you can start to treat it as more of a challenge run than a chase sequence, which makes it one of the only encounters that I'll actually just come back to because it's that fun. Now, the main reason I haven't ranked it higher is because this is the first major encounter in the series where you're meant to actually outsmart and defeat the monster instead of just running for your life like a headless chicken. And while I appreciate the creativity of the encounter, this had the unfortunate side effect of completely neutering the tension and fear, especially on repeat playthroughs. And this design philosophy heavily influenced the encounters in Chapter 4. So while I do enjoy the CatNap fight, it marks a major turning point in the series away from pure horror, which is honestly kind of a downer for me. But the next entry on our list, also from Chapter 3, is all about that sheer unrelenting terror. Coming in at number 5, we have DogDay. Taking place immediately after the Ruined Critters encounter, you enter a makeshift prison where you're brought face to face with one of the most gruesome sights in the entire series, the last of the smiling critters, DogDay. He's suspended by his wrist with his lower body completely removed and a belt crudely tied around his waist to prevent his insides from spilling out. He explains that CatNap views the prototype as a god and violently punishes any heretics that try to resist. It's a truly bone-chilling reveal, but the conversation is short-lived as a horde of ruined critters bursts through the pipes and devours him from the inside, kicking off the first truly horrifying chase sequence on this list. You've only got one objective: run. You try desperately to stay ahead of DogDay, whose hands pound maddeningly against the walls as he pursues you. And just when you think you're safe, he cuts you off once more and forces you to make one last desperate jump to the other side of the room to get away. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I don't know how much this actually resonates with everyone else, but when I was younger, I used to have this recurring nightmare about a shadowy figure with glowing white eyes and an evil smile chasing me through my house. So scenes like this just scare the absolute crap out of me. But even beyond that, I think what makes the DogDay chase and others in the series so effective is the way they force you to make split-second decisions to navigate spaces that are designed to make you feel trapped and disoriented. The DogDay chase, for example, largely takes place in McDonald's-style play place tunnels, and you're constantly met with branching paths where the correct way forward isn't always immediately obvious. You just have to pick a direction and hope that you made the right choice. And if you didn't... And speaking of pure horror, number 4 on this list is the final minigame from Chapter 2, Statues. This is a kind of red light, green light style minigame where you have to make your way through an obstacle course while PJ Pugapillar constantly trails after you. If he catches up to you, you die. If you move while the lights are on, you die. If you make it to the very end of the course and somehow fail to notice the totally obvious flashing light that points to a grappling location, and therefore decide to make your way back through the arena to buy some time to think like I did on my first playthrough, you die. This encounter is insanely creepy from start to finish. Before you even get into the room, you can hear him skittering along inside the walls. Then he slowly starts to emerge from the ceiling as you're listening to the instructions of the game, which immediately makes you want to get the hell away from him. So when the music starts, you haul as much ass as you're physically capable of hauling, and as the lights come on, you're forced to stop moving. You've got no choice but to watch him slither towards you while listening to his rapid, scuttling steps. There's just something so unsettling about the utter loss of control the game subjects you to during this sequence, and it's one of the few encounters that still manages to keep the tension high, even after going through it multiple times. So even though it might not match the technical depth or spectacle of the encounters in chapters 3 and 4, when talking about pure horror, it's hard to think of many examples that do it better than statues. And with that, we have now entered the top 3, so before we go any further in the video, I want you to pause right now and tell me 2 things in the comments. First, what is your favorite moment from the Poppy Playtime series? And second, what do you think my number 1 pick is going to be? And no cheating.
Great cheaters!
Kicking off the top 3 from Chapter 3, we have Miss Delight. Her chase is actually the first one we see in Chapter 3, and the terror starts as soon as we enter the school. After making our way through the first couple of halls, we get a brief glimpse of Miss Delight limping monstrously through the hall. As you make your way further inside, she begins to talk to you directly using the school's PA system, and you get more quick yet startling glances of her searching the school for you. When you finally turn on the school's generator, she bursts through the door and destroys it. And with that, the chase is on. Miss Delight has one of the most unique chase sequences in the entire series. For Doctor Who fans, she basically operates like a weeping angel and will only give chase when you're not looking at her. You need to use this knowledge to your advantage, since getting out of the school alive will require you to solve a series of increasingly complex puzzles. But even though she can't move when you're looking at her, be careful not to get too close anyways, or you'll be treated to the universe's most disgusting makeout session. What I love about this encounter is that on paper it seems pretty easy to cheese, right? You just constantly walk backwards and she can never get too close to you. If only it were that simple. This school is packed with tight corridors and locked gates where you have no choice but to stop, giving her ample time to catch up to you. There's something so insanely creepy about being forced to wait around for a gate to open up when you know she's coming after you, only to see her come around the corner and just stop and stare at you with those nightmare-inducing white eyes. The final set of locks is particularly nerve-wracking because you're forced to turn around to place a couple of the batteries, even while she's standing in the room with you. And if that weren't bad enough, you can practically feel her labored breathing on your neck as she shuffles closer and closer to you. This is the only encounter on the list where watching the footage back after the fact still gave me the creeps, and if nothing else, I think that more than justifies its spot in the top 3. Moving on to number 2, we have the iconic Huggy Wuggy. Huggy Wuggy is one of the first things you see when you enter Playtime Co., and while he's a little bit creepy, he doesn't immediately register as a threat. But then, after solving a simple electricity puzzle and making your way back to the entrance, he's just gone. This immediately raises the hairs on the back of your neck because, well, where the hell is he? And as you go deeper and deeper into the factory, it becomes apparent that you are not alone here. At the end of the chapter, you think you're on your way to leave the factory, only to be confronted with one of the most viscerally scary creatures in all of gaming. Huggy Wuggy is a gigantic, looming nightmare, and the way his expression goes from a seemingly innocuous smile to this gaping maw with multiple rows of jagged teeth is so shocking that it immediately activates that reptile part of your brain that causes you to flee in terror. What follows is a chase sequence through the vents that is utterly terrifying. From the way he suddenly appears in front of you to cut off your path, to the pounding of his hands and feet as he chases after you, the entire chase is designed to make you abandon any logical thought and rely purely on instinct. And I'm telling you, the first time I got to the part just before the exit where the door slams in front of your face, I about lost my mind and taught my kids a whole bunch of naughty words that they were not ready to learn. Chapter 1 is shorter and more straightforward than a lot of the later games in the series, but this simplicity is one of its greatest strengths, as every moment is used to create a rising sense of tension and fear, and escaping from the freak of nature that is Huggy Wuggy was the perfect way to end the game. But there's one more creature on the list that still manages to make me feel like an impotent child, even after going through her encounter numerous times, and that is my pick for number 1, Mommy Longlegs. Where Huggy Wuggy is designed to make you run for your life in abject terror, Mommy Longlegs is an experience much more rooted in psychological horror. After solving a fairly tricky electricity puzzle, you make your way back through the vents only to be dropped into an empty hallway with nowhere to go but up. But when you go to grapple up to the door, Mommy Longlegs drops down from the ceiling out of nowhere, howling in fury at you for having the audacity to not let yourself get killed in the statues game. I mentioned before that I played these games with my kids, and this was the only moment across all 4 games that was so frightening that I actually yelped in fear in front of them. And it only gets worse as she creeps closer and closer to you, literally pushing your back against the wall and making you feel utterly at her mercy before beginning a countdown to the most fear-inducing version of hide and seek imaginable. The first time I played this and she got down to 2, I was so on edge with anxiety that I was about to get jump scared that I had to pause the game and take a breath before I could continue. You eventually do get a break when you get to a room that has 4 levers in it, and there's a cleverly placed wire that guides your eyes up to a hidden room in the ceiling which gives you the order that you need to pull the levers in order to open the door. But making your way through the next area reveals that Mommy Longlegs was waiting for you to come this way. She forces you back into the lever room, moaning and laughing in this completely unhinged voice. And as you make your way to the door, you find that it's blocked. You're left with no choice but to grapple your way back up into the ceiling and pray that she'll somehow fail to find you. And this moment right here is my favorite thing in the entire series. See, Chapter 2 is entirely themed around psychological horror, and it does this by turning every encounter into a twisted version of a children's game. The first time I went through the Mommy Longlegs chase, I had no idea whether or not hiding in the ceiling would even work. But when it did, it was like a light bulb clicked inside my brain, and I was like, oh, I get it, hide and seek, that's so clever. I guess what I'm trying to say is, the way that they took what could have been a generic chase sequence and actually designed it around the theme of the rest of the game is nothing short of brilliant. And even though I've gone through the end sequence half a dozen times at this point, and I know how it works inside and out, it's the one chase that still makes me feel afraid as I'm going through it. And that's why I feel it deserves the #1 spot on my list. But those are just my thoughts. What is your favorite encounter in the series, and do you disagree with any of the placements on my list? Let me know down in the comments, and I will see you all in the next video.